Usually when you go to the eye doctor, there is this expectation of precision, like engineering.
Right.
You sit in the chair, and they slide that heavy metal machine in front of your face. They flip the lenses, and it is a binary choice. Better or worse, number one or number two.
Yeah, it is very straightforward.
It is clean. We like things to be visible, to be categorized. We want to know precisely what we are looking at. But then you step into the world of human morality, into the realm of what makes a person truly good, and suddenly that lens machine is broken. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, it is just murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, the letters on the wall are no longer just blurry or sharp. They seem to change depending on who is reading them.
Yeah. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are taking a deep dive into a very specific, highly influential text by Jonathan Edwards. It is titled The Nature of True Virtue. But we are zeroing in on one particular section that deals with a concept he calls the secondary and inferior kind of beauty. Our mission today, the central mystery we want to solve with you, the listener, is this. Why do we find things beautiful? And maybe a bigger question, does having good taste in art or music or architecture make someone a morally good person?
We blur those lines all the time in our culture, don't we?
Oh, absolutely.
We look at someone who creates breathtaking art or, someone who can organize a flawless charity event, and we just assume they must possess a beautiful soul. But Edwards puts up a massive stop sign right here.
Yeah, he really does.
He forces us to separate our aesthetic reflexes from our moral judgments. He sets out to prove that the mechanism inside us that appreciates a perfect sunset or a brilliant piece of music is completely different from the mechanism that constitutes true moral goodness.
I want to take our time with this. We need to lay out the architecture of his argument carefully. Because once you see the world through his categorization, well, you start noticing these divisions everywhere.
You really do.
He starts by splitting beauty into two entirely distinct categories: primary beauty and secondary beauty.
Let us start with primary beauty. For Edwards, primary beauty is spiritual. It is moral. He defines it as the union of a heart to being in general. It is the moral amiableness of spiritual beings who possess understanding and will.
Let us pause right there, because being in general is a massive concept. When I hear that phrase, it feels like a philosophical wall of text.
It does sound intimidating at first.
Let me see if I can reason this out. If being just means existence or reality, then being in general encompasses everything that exists, but obviously not everything possesses the same amount of reality. I mean, God possesses infinite existence.
That is the core of it, yeah. God is the ultimate being. He is the source of all other being. So, by extension, primary beauty is a love and benevolence toward all creation in proportion to its worth, but it must be anchored in the highest being. Edwards calls this a cordial agreement. Cordial, meaning an agreement of the heart. If a person's heart is united in love to God and subsequently to others based on their relationship to God, that is primary beauty. That is true virtue. It requires a conscious choice, an active disposition of benevolence.
So it is an active, willing posture.
Exactly.
A person has to have an understanding, and they have to will their heart toward the good of another. That makes sense. But then we have this other category, secondary beauty, which he also calls inferior or natural beauty.
Right.
This is where things get fascinating, because this type of beauty is not peculiar to spiritual beings. It is found in inanimate things.
Yes. Secondary beauty consists of mutual consent, agreement, regularity, proportion, and symmetry.
Right.
It is the physical harmony of things fitting together properly. Edwards is adamant about this. These two types of beauty are entirely distinct. They share nothing of the same nature, even though, we use the word beauty to describe both of them.
Let me offer an analogy to help clarify the gap between these two. Think about the difference between admiring the sleek, symmetrical design of a modern smartphone versus admiring a person who selflessly gives their life to save a stranger.
Oh, I follow the logic there. Let us break that down a bit more.
Well, when you look at the smartphone, you are admiring secondary beauty. The glass meets the metal seamlessly. The icons on the screen are evenly spaced. The weight of it in your hand feels balanced.
It is very satisfying to hold.
Yeah, it is regular. It possesses proportion. But the phone does not have a will. It does not have a heart. It is just matter arranged in a highly agreeable way.
While the person jumping on a grenade to save a stranger, that action might be physically horrifying to witness.
Right.
It might be loud, chaotic, and destructive. There is no physical symmetry or pleasing proportion to the event itself. Yet we look at that selfless act and we recognize it as a beautiful thing to do.
We recognize the primary beauty. We see the moral amiableness, the union of that person's heart to the well-being of others. The problem arises when we look at the smartphone, or a painting, or a building, and we trick ourselves into thinking that the physical symmetry carries some sort of moral weight.
Yes.
We think the designer of the phone must be a virtuous person simply because they understand symmetry.
Which naturally leads us to ask about the mechanics. If secondary beauty applies to physical, inanimate objects, what are the actual rules that make those objects beautiful to our eyes?
That is a great question.
If it is not moral goodness causing the beauty, what is the math behind our appreciation?
Let us investigate the math. Edwards leans heavily on a concept here from a philosopher named Francis Hutcheson. The phrase he brings into the discussion is uniformity in the midst of variety.
Uniformity in the midst of variety.
Huh.
Yeah, Edwards argues that the greater the variety of things that mutually agree with one another, well, the greater the beauty.
Okay.
We appreciate it when different, distinct elements somehow come together to form a cohesive, agreeable whole.
Let me reason through why variety is necessary there. If we just wanted uniformity, we would just stare at a blank white wall.
Right.
Blank wall is perfectly uniform, but it is not beautiful. It is boring. The mind needs variety to have something to process.
That is a sharp distinction. Uniformity without variety provides no stimulus. Variety without uniformity is just chaos.
Yeah.
If I throw a handful of random debris on the floor, it has infinite variety, but no uniformity. The mind cannot find any pattern, so it rejects it as ugly. The magic happens when the mind perceives distinct, varied things coming together under a unified rule.
He gives tangible examples in the text.
Yeah.
Things we see every day. He talks about the sides of a square
Yeah.
or an equilateral triangle.
Think about a square. You have 4 distinct lines and 4 distinct angles. That constitutes the variety, but they're all perfectly equal to one another.
Right.
That constitutes the uniformity. The mind perceives those 4 distinct things agreeing perfectly, and it registers as beautiful.
He also mentions the periphery of a circle. Every single point on the outside of the circle is the exact same distance from the center. It is an infinite variety of points, but an absolute uniformity of distance.
That's a great visual.
He brings up the spots on a chessboard, too. The alternating colors, the consistent dimensions, the equal distances of the squares. It is highly satisfying to look at.
And he scales it up beyond basic geometry. He mentions the figures on a piece of chintz or brocade, the repeating interlocking patterns on fabric.
Yeah.
He points to the proportions of the human face, the symmetry of our features. He even applies this to sound, mentioning the harmonious, sweet mutual consent of the various notes in a melodious tune.
So it is not just visual.
No, when multiple different notes are struck at once, but their vibrational frequencies align in a mathematical ratio, we hear harmony. Variety in the notes, uniformity in the mathematical ratio.
I want to push back on this a little bit, or at least ask a functional question about everyday objects.
Yeah.
What about when things are just useful? Because you can have something that isn't perfectly symmetrical, but it does its job incredibly well. Does Edwards account for utility? Do we find things beautiful just because they work?
He addresses utility, actually, and his answer is quite elegant. He states that the visible fitness of a thing to its use is not a different kind of beauty, it is just another form of proportion. Utility is a type of agreement.
How does utility function as an agreement?
He describes it as the fitness of a cause to a visibly designed effect. When you see a tool that is perfectly shaped for the job it needs to do, your mind recognizes the agreement between the physical object and its intended purpose.
Okay, I think I see where you're going.
The example he offers is fitting a mortise to its tenon in woodworking.
For anyone who hasn't done woodworking, a mortise is a cavity or a hole cut into a piece of wood, and a tenon is a projecting piece of wood designed to fit flawlessly into that specific hole.
Right. And when you slide the tenon into the mortise and they lock together without any gaps, it is immensely satisfying. The 2 distinct pieces of wood agree with one another perfectly. Their forms consent to one another.
So utility is just uniformity applied to action. The form of the tool agrees with the required action of the task.
Edwards extrapolates this further. He talks about what happens when you look at an ingenious, complicated machine. He says there is a double beauty at play in complex mechanisms.
A double beauty. Let me think about that. If we are looking at something like a complex mechanical watch, we have hundreds of tiny pieces. You were saying there are 2 layers of agreement happening at the same time.
Yes. First, there is the agreement of all the various parts to the designed end. The gears, the springs, the levers, they are all fitted to make the hands on the watch face move at a precise speed.
Uh,
Every piece is subordinated to that final goal.
right.
That is the first layer of beauty.
Wait, how can parts agree with each other if they do completely different things?
Mhm.
A coiled spring does not do the same thing as a toothed gear. They look different and they act differently. How is there agreement between them?
They agree by not impeding each other and by harmonizing their distinct functions toward the final end. Because they all agree with that final intended effect, they consequently all agree with one another.
Oh, I see.
They are united in a common purpose. The gear accepts the tension of the spring perfectly. The hand accepts the rotation of the gear perfectly. So you have parts agreeing with the whole and parts agreeing with each other. It is a compounding effect of uniformity in variety.
We have established that our brains love patterns, symmetry, perfectly fitted joints, and complex machinery working in harmony. But this raises an enormous cosmic question.
It really does.
If this secondary beauty is just physical, if it is just math, geometry, and structural ratios, why did God create it this way? Why does the universe care? If a square has equal sides, why do we care?
That is the pivotal transition in the argument. Edwards addresses the theological rationale behind all this math and symmetry. He argues that God created this mutual agreement in physical things to be an image or a shadow of true spiritual beauty.
A shadow.
Remember, true primary beauty is the cordial union of spiritual beings, hearts united in love to God and to one another. God designed the physical universe so that when diverse physical things become one through uniformity, like the notes of a chord or the sides of a square, it physically mirrors that spiritual reality.
So the physical world is acting out a play about the spiritual world. The material universe is a constant silent metaphor for the union of hearts.
Edwards notes that it pleases God to establish analogies in his works. He points out that God does this everywhere. He forms brutes, animals in analogy to mankind. He forms plants in analogy to animals with respect to how they generate and receive nutrition.
Yeah.
He creates these echoing patterns across different domains of creation.
God is rhyming with himself. He establishes a pattern in the spiritual realm, and then he rhymes that pattern in the physical realm.
He has constituted the external physical world in analogy to the spiritual world. So when we observe an agreement of different things in form or measure, it appears beautiful to us because it is an image of that higher spiritual consent of minds.
That is fascinating.
The concord of a melodious tune is beautiful because it represents the sweet union of a society of intelligent beings perfectly united in benevolent agreement of heart.
If I am tracking with this, secondary beauty is just a reflection. But I have to ask, if it is just a shadow, does it have any practical spiritual benefit for the observer? Or is it just a neat piece of cosmic trivia?
Good question.
I mean, if I look at a beautiful sunset, does that actually make me a better person?
It has a specific benefit, but Edwards adds a crucial caveat. He states that experiencing the secondary beauty, listening to a stunning piece of music, or looking at the beauty of nature can dispose a person toward divine love and enliven their sense of spiritual beauty, but only if their hearts are already under the influence of a truly virtuous temper.
So the shadow does not create the virtue.
It does not. The music assists and enlivens the virtue that is already present. If a person already possesses that primary cordial beauty, that love for God, then seeing the shadow of it in nature can stir up those affections. It acts as a reminder.
Right.
But the shadow cannot plant the seed of true virtue where none exists. A corrupt heart can look at a sunset and feel aesthetic pleasure, but it will not magically generate love for God.
That distinction changes how we view art entirely. And knowing why it was created to be this shadow, this analogy, leads us to ask how we actually process this beauty in our daily lives.
Yes.
Because, let us be honest, when I am listening to a great piece of music, I am not consciously thinking, yes, this melody is a perfect shadow of the cordial union of spiritual beings. I am just tapping my foot and enjoying the sound.
Edwards recognizes that reality, actually. This brings us to one of his most fascinating arguments. Our appreciation of secondary beauty is caused by an instinct. It is a law of nature fixed by God. It is not caused by our intellectual understanding of the proportions or the spiritual analogies.
It operates entirely on the subconscious level.
Completely. Edwards uses the musical example to make this point. A person can be moved to tears by the harmony of a tune, and yet they might know absolutely nothing about the mathematical adjustments of the notes that create that harmony.
They do not need to know the physics.
They do not need to know that an octave is a 1-to-2 vibration ratio. They do not need to know that a perfect fifth is a 2-to-3 ratio.
Right.
They do not even need to know that sound travels via vibrations in the air or how the auditory nerve translates those vibrations into electrical signals in the brain. They are totally ignorant of the mechanics, yet they experience the full weight of the beauty.
Here is where I like to think about food. It is like eating an incredible meal prepared by a master chef. You sit down, you take a bite of this perfectly seared steak, and your eyes just roll back in your head. It is delicious.
Right.
But you do not need to understand the chemical reactions happening to the sugars and proteins when the meat hits the hot pan. You do not need to know the precise measurements of the ingredients the chef used. The pleasure is immediate.
Yes,
It
exactly.
completely bypasses the intellect. You taste it, and your body says, yes, this is good.
God has established a law of nature, an instinct, that dictates when these proportions are present, the human mind will experience pleasure. You do not have to calculate the math. It is an automatic reflex granted by the Creator.
Edwards contrasts this heavily with primary beauty.
The contrast is vital for his whole thesis.
Re-
With primary beauty, spiritual beauty, perceiving the union is the pleasure. It requires the intellect. It requires a person to see the moral amiableness and consciously agree with it. It is an immediate view of the thing itself. But with secondary beauty, you are not appreciating the spiritual reality. You are just enjoying the instinctual pleasure granted by the established law of nature.
Let us look at the variables here, because not all secondary beauty hits us with the same force. Sometimes we see a pattern and think, that is nice, and other times we see a pattern and we are completely awestruck.
Sure.
What are the levers that amplify our experience of secondary beauty?
Edwards identifies two major conditions that amplify this effect: scale and strictness of connection. Let us examine scale first. He notes that all other things being equal, uniformity and proportion affect the mind far more when they are found in objects of considerable magnitude.
So a larger scale creates a stronger aesthetic impact.
Yes, or at least a more significant subject matter is more striking. The example he provides is the human body. The perfect symmetry of a human face or body hits the mind with much more force than the symmetry of a small flower.
We are naturally wired to notice each other. The stakes are higher when looking at another human being than when looking at a dandelion.
He takes the concept of scale even further. He argues that the order and uniformity of the entire solar system is vastly more impressive than the same amount of order found in a single tree.
That makes sense.
A grand, towering palace is more pleasing to look at than a tiny, well-proportioned toy house built for a child. The magnitude of the object amplifies the weight of the beauty we perceive.
That covers scale. What about connection? How does that work as a variable?
Connection is about how closely related the agreeing parts are to one another. Edwards argues that uniformity only really works if there is a relationship connecting the things together.
Give me an example of that.
Well, if you have a bunch of uniform, identical pillars scattered randomly across distant fields miles apart from each other, they offer no real beauty.
Because your eye cannot take them in together. They are not collaborating on anything. They are just isolated objects.
But if you take those exact same pillars and arrange them in a single row along the facade of a building, suddenly they possess immense beauty.
Okay.
The strictness of their connection, their relation to the same structure, makes their uniformity visible and pleasing. They are united by their proximity and their shared function.
This makes me wonder about the flip side. If connection amplifies beauty, does it also amplify ugliness? Edwards has an interesting note about deformity in the text.
He points out that disproportion or disagreement is vastly more offensive to the mind when things are closely related.
If you have two things that look wildly different and disproportionate, but they are located in completely different cities, you do not care. It does not bother you at all.
Right.
But if you put those two clashing, disproportionate things right next to each other, attached to the same object, like two mismatched crooked pillars on the front of a house, it is jarring. The closer the connection, the worse the clash feels to the observer.
The human mind desires harmony where there is connection. When that expectation of harmony is broken, the instinctual reflex is revulsion.
We have laid out these physical rules: scale, connection, uniformity, proportion. Here is where Edwards takes a massive conceptual leap.
He really does.
He pivots from physical objects like pillars and solar systems, and he asks, How do these exact same rules apply to invisible, immaterial concepts?
This is where his synthesis of ideas is remarkable. He explains that secondary beauty is not restricted to material things. It applies to immaterial things through the exact same mechanism.
Okay.
If uniformity and proportion please the mind when observed in physical shapes, why wouldn't they please the mind when observed in spiritual or abstract concepts?
What kind of immaterial things are we talking about here? Because a thought does not have physical dimensions. You cannot measure a thought with a ruler.
He provides several examples to ground this idea. The first is society. He states there is a beauty of order in society quite apart from actual moral benevolence. Think about a society where different members all hold their appointed offices, utilize their specific talents properly, and everyone keeps their place and continues in their proper business.
Like a well-oiled machine.
He compares it directly to architecture. A well-ordered society is like a building where the strong pillars are placed where strong pillars need to be, the square pieces of marble are in the pavement, and the cornices are up top. It is structural regularity applied to human organization.
Are you saying a society can be aesthetically beautiful in its structure, even if it is completely lacking in primary cordial beauty? Even if the citizens do not actually love each other, they just go to work and follow the rules?
Yes, structural efficiency is a secondary beauty. The trains running on time is an aesthetic pleasure, not necessarily a moral one.
Wow, okay.
He also applies this to wisdom. He defines wisdom here as the united tendency of various thoughts and ideas to one general purpose. If a mind organizes 100 distinct thoughts to solve one problem, that is uniformity and variety. It is beautiful to witness a sharp mind at work, regardless of whether the general purpose they are working toward is actually a good one.
The biggest immaterial concept he tackles in this section is justice. This feels like the heaviest part of the text.
It is the most complex application of the theory. Edwards argues that justice is fundamentally a natural agreement of things in nature and measure.
Let me see if I can reason this out. If justice is an aesthetic proportion, how does that work in practice? If someone steals from me and the judge forces them to pay me back, I feel satisfied. Is Edwards arguing that my satisfaction is just the same feeling I get when a chord resolves in a song? Is it just a balancing of scales?
He focuses on the concept of punishment and reward. If someone out of malice does evil to others, justice dictates that they should receive evil in return in proportion to the evil they committed. It is an agreement of measure. If you steal $1, you should not be imprisoned for life. That is disproportionate.
It does not fit the mortis and tenon.
On the positive side, rewarding love with love is proportional. It is a harmonious corresponding of one thing with another, acts answering to their occasions. The duties of children to parents, citizens to rulers. There is a natural structural fitness to these relationships.
Wait, I need to push back here for the listener. By categorizing justice as an inferior secondary beauty, is Edwards downplaying justice? Is he saying justice isn't a true virtue? Because that sounds highly controversial.
It is a vital distinction to make, and Edwards anticipates this pushback. He addresses a specific error made by a philosopher named Mr. Wollaston. Wollaston tried to resolve all virtue, all moral goodness, simply into this natural agreement with truth and proportion. He argued that if an action is proportional and fits the occasion, it is virtuous.
So Woolston is saying that just doing the structural math makes you a good person. If the punishment fits the crime, our brain treats it like a matched set of bookends, and therefore we've achieved true morality.
Edwards replies, no. That is a structural beauty, but it falls completely short of true virtue. True virtue is higher. It is benevolence to being in general.
Let us clearly define what constitutes that higher beauty then. This brings us to a showdown. True virtue versus the proportion of justice.
Edwards states it clearly. There is a higher beauty than uniformity or similarity. True virtue is the union of heart to being in general, which appears in various virtues as expressions or effects of that love.
Benevolence to being in general. Loving God and loving creation.
It is not a blind, equal distribution of love. A truly virtuous person loves beings based on their dignity.
How does he define dignity? Because we use that word today to mean self-respect or worth.
In this context, he defines dignity as a combination of two things: their degree of being and their degree of virtue. The more being someone has, and God possesses infinite being, and the more virtue they have, the more dignity they possess, and therefore the more a virtuous heart will naturally love them.
Where does justice fit into that? If true virtue is this benevolent love based on dignity, why do we care about proportional justice at all?
Because of the order of operations. This is the crucial causal relationship. Edwards carefully explains that benevolence to being in general naturally inclines a person toward justice and proportion.
Benevolence causes the justice.
Yes, the proportion we see in objects or situations does not cause the benevolence. You do not look at a balanced equation and suddenly generate a virtuous heart. It is the other way around.
Right.
A truly benevolent heart, looking out at the world, wants things to be properly ordered and proportional because that serves the general good. Benevolence produces justice.
I have a physics analogy based on the text that might help lock this in. Think about gravity. The tendency of physical bodies to attract each other in proportion to their mass is the consequence of the existence of mutual attraction. It is not the other way around.
That is the right way to frame it.
The mass, the existence of the bodies, and the underlying force of attraction is the root. The mathematical proportion of how they pull on each other is just the fruit. You do not get gravity because of the mass. You get the math because gravity exists. Proportion is the fruit, not the root.
That means just affections and acts have a beauty in them that is distinct from and superior to their mere structural uniformity. A truly virtuous temper delights in justice, not just because it is a neat, tidy equation, but because it is an expression of benevolence to being in general.
Yeah.
It glorifies God and serves the general good.
If someone is just executing justice because they like the tidy equation, they are not practicing true virtue. They are just practicing aesthetic appreciation.
Which brings us to the grand illusion, the final striking conclusion Edwards leads us to. Having a disposition to approve of secondary beauty, having good taste, appreciating proportion, even appreciating structural justice, has absolutely nothing to do with a truly virtuous taste.
This is the hammer drop. Loving the harmony of good music, or the symmetry of an equilateral triangle, or the sleek design of a building is not holiness.
If appreciating proportion was a sign of virtue, then a person's delight in architecture, embroidery, or geometry would increase right alongside their moral goodness. The holiest people would inherently be the greatest architects and mathematicians.
We know from human history that is false. Edwards makes a very sharp observation of reality here. He points out that highly vicious, corrupt individuals often possess incredibly refined tastes in art, math, and physical beauty.
History is replete with tyrants who wept at the opera, or cruel leaders who commissioned breathtakingly beautiful palaces.
Right.
Their appreciation for the uniformity in the midst of variety was functioning perfectly. Their secondary aesthetic reflex was sharp, but their primary moral reflex, their benevolence to being in general, was completely dead.
Edwards argues that appreciating a well-proportioned building is no more a sign of moral goodness than enjoying the sweet taste of honey or the pleasant smell of a rose. It is a biological and structural instinct.
Yeah.
If it feels good to taste honey, it feels good to look at a symmetrical face. It requires absolutely no moral fortitude to enjoy either of those things.
Therefore, Edwards concludes this analysis by pointing out a catastrophic error made by many moral philosophers of his day. They mistake this natural, instinctual taste for proportion and symmetry as an implanted seed of true virtue. They think that because humans naturally recoil from disproportion and ugliness, that humans naturally possess a seed of true moral goodness.
They confuse the shadow for the substance.
They confuse the instinctual law of nature for a cordial union of the heart. By doing so, they misunderstand the nature of true virtue entirely.
We have covered an immense amount of ground here. Let me synthesize this entire conversation for you, the listener, so you can see the whole map. We started by separating everything into two buckets.
Right.
In bucket A, we have primary beauty, true virtue, the cordial union of the heart toward God and being in general. In bucket B, we have secondary beauty, natural inferior beauty based on uniformity, proportion, and physical agreement.
That is a helpful way to summarize it.
We saw that bucket B covers everything from geometry to music to the structural order of society, and even the basic mechanisms of proportional justice. We learned that God designed bucket B to be a physical shadow of the spiritual realities in bucket A. Crucially, we learned that operating effectively in bucket B, having great taste in art, understanding complex math, organizing a tidy society, does not mean a person possesses anything from bucket A. The instinctual appreciation of proportion is just an instinct.
Like tasting honey.
Exactly, like tasting honey. True holiness, true virtue, is an entirely distinct operation of the heart.
It is a rigorous, demanding framework, but it brings immense clarity to how we view human achievements and human nature.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on all this source material. Consider the halo effect in modern society. Think about how frequently we assume that someone who is physically beautiful or someone who creates transcendent beautiful art and music must also possess a good, wise, and virtuous soul.
It is so common.
We grant them moral authority simply because they have mastered secondary beauty. How might understanding Edwards' strict division between natural taste and true virtue change the way you evaluate the celebrities, the artists, and the leaders you admire today?
That is a great question to ask.
Are we looking for true benevolence to being in general, or are we just being hypnotized by a perfectly fitted mortise and tenon? Think about that vision test at the eye doctor. Is the lens actually clear, or are we just admiring the heavy metal machine? Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on reformed thinking. We appreciate your time, and we hope you walk away seeing the world just a little bit clearer. Have a great day.